There's a specific curiosity that develops during no contact, one almost everyone experiences even while genuinely committed to maintaining the silence. What is he actually doing right now, today, in the ordinary, unremarkable hours of a day that no longer includes you? Not the dramatic crisis moments we've traced throughout this series, but the mundane, daily texture of his life during this period. Today, we're going to trace exactly what a typical day often looks like for a narcissist during no contact, drawing together everything we've established throughout this entire series into a specific day by day picture, one that reveals something important. The daily reality is usually considerably less dramatic and considerably more mundane than either the fantasy of his devastation or the fear of his effortless indifference might suggest. Let's start with the morning, because the specific quality of how his day begins reveals something worth understanding about the underlying psychological state we've traced extensively throughout this series. Mornings during genuine, sustained no contact often carry a specific quality of low-grade unease that he typically cannot trace back to its actual source. Remember what we discussed about regulatory outsourcing, the way his nervous system had grown accustomed to whatever stabilizing function your presence previously provided. This absence doesn't necessarily announce itself as clear, conscious grief the moment he wakes up. It often manifests as something vaguer, a slightly harder time getting motivated, a background restlessness that seems disconnected from any specific cause, a tendency to reach for his phone slightly more often than usual, checking notifications with a specific kind of hopeful anticipation he probably wouldn't consciously identify as related to you at all. Here's what typically happens next, and it connects to something we discussed extensively about proximity testing. During the earlier phases of no contact, mornings often include a specific ritual, whether consciously acknowledged or not. Checking whether you've engaged with anything of his, a social media post, a status update, any small digital signal that might indicate continued attention. This checking typically happens quickly, almost reflexively, and produces a small, disproportionate emotional response depending on what it reveals. A response he likely files away without fully examining, simply absorbing the momentary disappointment or the momentary relief before moving on with his actual day. Here's what the middle of his day often looks like, and understanding this matters because it reveals something important about how thoroughly the crisis we've traced throughout this series actually integrates into ordinary daily functioning, rather than remaining a distinct, separate emotional event happening alongside otherwise normal life. Remember what we discussed about narrative reconstruction, the ongoing work required to maintain a version of events that protects his self-concept. This work doesn't happen in a single dedicated session. It happens in small, distributed moments throughout an ordinary day, a passing thought during a work meeting that gets quickly reframed, a comment to a colleague about the relationship that reveals which version of the story he's currently telling, a brief internal justification that surfaces and gets dismissed almost as quickly as it arrived. This ongoing distributed narrative maintenance work explains something worth understanding clearly. His days likely don't feel to him like they're organized around processing your absence, even though considerable psychological energy is actually being spent on exactly this task throughout the day, simply distributed across small, largely unconscious moments, rather than concentrated into anything he'd recognize as deliberate grief processing. Here's what afternoons often include, connecting to something we discussed extensively about supply diversification. If enough time has passed, afternoons increasingly include whatever alternative sources of validation he's actively cultivating, messages to new romantic prospects, increased engagement with existing relationships that can provide some of what your absence has removed, professional pursuits approached with slightly more intensity than usual, as though achievement might fill a specific gap that achievement was never actually designed to fill. This isn't necessarily conscious strategy. It often manifests simply as increased restlessness, increased social outreach, a kind of scattered energy directed at whatever sources of engagement remain available. Together, this picture of an ordinary day, the low-grade morning unease, the reflexive checking, the distributed narrative maintenance work threading through otherwise normal activities, the afternoon energy redirected toward alternative sources, reveals something important worth carrying into how we understand the rest of what a typical day actually contains. Let's continue tracing what a typical day often includes, moving into evening and night, because these hours often reveal something distinctly different from the daytime patterns we've already discussed, connecting to mechanisms we've traced throughout this entire series in ways worth examining specifically through this daily lens. Here's what evenings often look like, particularly during the earlier phases of no contact when the crisis we've traced extensively remains most acute. Remember what we discussed about the specific vulnerability that emerges once the day's structured activities, work, errands, whatever distraction the daytime naturally provides, give way to unstructured time. Evenings often bring exactly the kind of quiet that removes the distributed distraction we discussed earlier, leaving considerably more space for the low-grade unease from the morning to resurface with greater intensity, less filtered by ongoing activity. This is often when the behaviors we traced in our conversation about narcissists during no contact become most active, the proximity testing through social media, the drafted and deleted messages, the specific evening restlessness that sometimes produces the late-night contact attempts many people report receiving during exactly these hours. Remember what we discussed about why timing matters, why contact attempts often arrive at specific predictable moments rather than randomly throughout the day. Evening specifically produces this pattern because it's precisely when the daytime's distributed distraction stops providing sufficient buffer against the underlying discomfort we've traced throughout this entire series. Here's what's worth understanding about the specific quality of this evening experience, connecting to something we discussed extensively about regulatory outsourcing. If your presence previously provided a specific kind of evening stabilization, someone to process the day with, someone whose engagement helped regulate his nervous system as the day wound down, evenings during no contact often represent the specific time of day when this absence registers most acutely, precisely because there's genuinely no substitute yet developed that provides this same function. This explains why evening, specifically, more than any other time of day, tends to produce the most active attempts at contact, the most visible signs of the internal crisis we've traced throughout this series. Here's what nights often include, particularly connecting to something we discussed in our conversation about narcissistic breakdown following permanent loss. Remember the regulatory collapse we traced extensively. Sleep disruption specifically identified as one of the most consistent, observable signs of genuine internal crisis. Nights during genuine no contact often include exactly this disruption: difficulty falling asleep that wasn't previously present, waking during the night with the specific kind of racing thoughts that indicate unprocessed psychological material actively working itself out beneath conscious awareness. Sometimes dreams that surface content he successfully avoided during his waking, narrative-managed daytime hours. This nighttime disruption matters for understanding something crucial about the overall daily pattern we've traced today. The psychological work of processing genuine loss doesn't stop simply because his conscious, daytime narrative has successfully reframed or minimized what happened. It continues, often more intensely, during exactly the unstructured, unmanaged hours when his defensive narrative construction has the least active control. The quiet evenings, the restless nights, the early morning moments before the day's structure and distraction have fully resumed. Here's something important worth understanding about how this daily pattern shifts as no contact extends over longer periods, connecting to everything we've traced throughout this series about the eventual trajectory of narcissistic crisis following permanent loss. In the earlier weeks, this daily pattern, morning unease, distributed daytime narrative maintenance, evening restlessness, nighttime disruption, tends to remain relatively intense and relatively consistent. As weeks extend into months, particularly if supply diversification succeeds in providing some alternative source of stabilization, this pattern often gradually shifts, with the intensity decreasing across each phase of the day, though rarely disappearing completely, particularly during evening and nighttime hours that continue proving most vulnerable to whatever underlying unresolved material remains. Here's what's crucial to understand about this daily pattern overall, something that connects directly to everything we've discussed throughout this entire series about what all of this actually means for you specifically, rather than simply satisfying curiosity about his experience. This daily reality, the low-grade unease, the reflexive checking, the distributed narrative work, the evening restlessness, the nighttime disruption, represents something considerably more mundane than either extreme fantasy people often construct during no contact. Neither the dramatic, visible devastation some people hope to eventually witness as validation, nor the effortless, complete indifference other people fear he's genuinely experiencing while they struggle with their own difficulty maintaining silence. The reality, most days, for most of this period, is simply this quiet, distributed, largely unconscious psychological labor happening beneath the surface of what likely still looks, to anyone observing his outward behavior, like a relatively ordinary functioning life. Because here's what all of this daily texture ultimately needs to lead toward. And it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving you simply with an interesting, detailed picture of his ordinary hours without addressing what genuinely matters most. What you do with this information and why understanding it shouldn't change your own daily practice of no contact at all. The first thing worth understanding clearly is why knowing all of this, the morning unease, the reflexive checking, the evening restlessness, the nighttime disruption, genuinely shouldn't alter how you're currently maintaining your own silence. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about detachment being the only thing that actually works. If you find yourself now imagining his specific daily rhythm, picturing the exact moment he might be checking for your response, timing your own behavior around when his restlessness peaks or fades, you've quietly transformed genuinely useful psychological understanding into exactly the kind of continued monitoring we've cautioned against throughout dozens of previous conversations in this series. Understanding his daily pattern was never meant to become a new form of tracking him. It was meant to satisfy genuine curiosity accurately, so that curiosity stops requiring speculation and can finally, completely rest. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about how this daily reality compares to whatever fantasy you may have constructed during your own period of no contact. Remember what we discussed about the two extremes people often imagine, either dramatic, satisfying devastation or effortless, painful indifference. The actual daily reality we've traced today sits considerably closer to neither extreme, which matters because both extremes, if you've been quietly hoping for one or fearing the other, have likely been costing you something important. Hoping for dramatic devastation keeps you oriented around eventually receiving confirmation of his suffering as validation for your own experience. Fearing effortless indifference keeps you anxious, wondering whether your absence genuinely mattered at all. The actual mundane reality, distributed unease, largely unconscious labor, ordinary functioning punctuated by evening restlessness and nighttime disruption, offers neither the satisfaction nor the fear, simply an accurate, considerably less dramatic picture that, once genuinely absorbed, tends to quiet both extremes rather than confirming either one. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in many different forms. This daily reality, however genuinely happening, belongs entirely to his own internal experience, and it was never actually meant to determine anything about how you spend your own days. This is worth stating directly because there's a subtle trap embedded in exactly this kind of detailed understanding, the temptation to let your own daily rhythm start orbiting around his, even unconsciously, simply by knowing so precisely what his mornings, afternoons, evenings, and nights actually contain. Real freedom here means your own mornings, your own afternoons, your own evenings, and your own nights remain entirely, completely your own, organized around your own genuine priorities and your own genuine life, regardless of whatever rhythm his days happen to follow on the other side of a separation you've already correctly maintained. If understanding his daily pattern in this much detail produces any lingering pull to check, to wonder, to time your own behavior around his, that pull is worth noticing honestly rather than acting on, precisely because acting on it would undo the very detachment this entire understanding was meant to support rather than undermine. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something genuinely important about how time actually changes this picture, beyond simply what we traced in the previous section about intensity gradually decreasing. As no contact extends into months and eventually years, something happens that matters considerably more for your own life than for his. The specific daily texture we've traced throughout this conversation stops being something you need any information about at all. Not because you've successfully predicted how it eventually resolves, but because your own days have genuinely, completely filled with your own life, your own priorities, your own relationships and pursuits, to the point where his daily rhythm, whatever it currently contains, simply stops registering as relevant information worth holding in your own awareness at all. This is worth naming as the actual, genuine endpoint of everything we've traced throughout this entire series, considerably more valuable than any detailed understanding of his ongoing internal experience. The goal was never to become an expert in his daily patterns, however genuinely satisfying that expertise might feel in the moment. The goal was always your own daily life becoming so genuinely, completely full and complete that his patterns, whatever they currently are, simply become irrelevant to your own continued flourishing. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this conversation. If you've read or listened to everything we've traced today and found yourself genuinely curious, genuinely wanting this specific detailed picture of his ordinary hours, that curiosity is completely human and completely understandable, especially if you're relatively early in your own process of no contact, still working through the specific uncertainty that curiosity like this often reflects. But notice honestly whether receiving this detailed picture actually resolves that curiosity, allowing you to move forward with less need for this kind of information, or whether it simply produces a new, more specific version of the same underlying need to know, to track, to remain oriented around understanding exactly what's happening on the other side of a separation that was always meant to become genuinely, completely irrelevant to your own continued life. If the former, this conversation has served its genuine purpose, satisfying curiosity accurately enough that it can finally, completely rest. If the latter, that's valuable, non-judgmental information about where you currently are in your own process, pointing toward exactly the kind of continued internal work, the grief, the self-trust, the alternative sources of meaning that this entire series has traced as the genuine path toward the freedom you're ultimately working to achieve. His days, whatever they currently contain, belong entirely to him. Your days, from this moment forward, deserve to belong entirely, completely to you, filled with whatever genuinely matters to your own continued life, unburdened by needing to know, track, or imagine what's happening in his mornings, his afternoons, his evenings, or his restless, disrupted nights on the other side of a silence you chose, correctly, to maintain.